Welcome to this webinar. It's the third in our series with the Arts Council NUI Galway writer in residence, Tanya Farrelly. Really gives me a chance, first of all, to thank Tanya for this wonderful series. We kicked off with a session on experimental fiction. Our second one last week was on the Irish short story, in which Tanya was actually, one of her collections was featuring in the discussion. And tonight we're discussing creative nonfiction with two leading figures. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation with Roisin Kiberd and Sophie White. So again, Tanya, thank you very much. I should explain, my name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. We're delighted to be hosting this event, and we run it in tandem with John Kenny and Mike McCormick, colleagues in the School of English and Creative Arts. Matthew Garrity is kind of running things behind the scenes, and we're grateful to him as ever. Recordings of the previous sessions are available on our YouTube channel, and this one will be as well. But again, looking forward to the discussion very much, and it really remains just to hand over to you, Tanya, for the proceedings. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Mike McCormick and John Kenny as well. This is my last event of the series, sadly, but I am delighted to be joined this evening by Roisin Kiberd and Sophie White. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the two writers before we begin our conversation. So Roisin's essays have been published in the Dublin Review, the White Review, the Stinging Fly, and Winter Papers. She's also written features on technology and culture for publications, including The Guardian, Vice, and Motherboard, where she wrote a column about internet subcultures. After many years living in the tech hub of Dublin, she now lives in Berlin, according to your book, Roisin, but I think you're back in Dublin with us now, aren't you? Okay, and then Sophie White is a writer and podcaster. Her first three books, Recipes for a Nervous Breakdown, Gill 2016, Filter This, Hachette 2019, and Unfiltered, Hachette 2020, have been bestsellers and award nominees. She lives in Dublin with her husband and her three sons, and she's going to talk to us tonight about her latest book, Corpsing, which was published by Tramp Press. So ladies, you're both very welcome. I'm delighted that you're joining me this evening for the last event in my Writer in Residence series. So just to kick off, we're talking about both your latest books this evening. And it struck me as I read both, I read Roisin's and Corpsing, you know, one after the other. And it struck me that there were a lot of things actually in common between the two books. And I guess, you know, one of the most evident things reading both is that they both came about as a result of a personal crisis. For you, Sophie, you know, you talk a lot about grief and the death of your dad and how that affected you. And Roisin, for you, it was after a breakdown which was brought on by technology, which is what this book is all about, looking at technology. So my first question, Roisin, is how did you know that the time was right to get this down on paper and to write The Disconnect?
That's so, yeah, I hate when people say that's such an interesting question all the time, but it is interesting because, yeah, it is one of those things where, I mean, I'm trying to write another book right now. I've kind of just finished a draft, and it's that you have to kind of, it's like divination, isn't it? Of working out like when an era has ended and you've taken what you need in inspiration and now you're going to move into writing, whether that's fictional or grounded in real life. But for this one, I knew that I was living through something ever since maybe around 2012, which is covered in the book. I mean, I was very, very, very inspired by the opening quote, which I had to basically approach and annoy the writer Bruce Sterling to get approval for, to use as the opening quote in the book. But it's about this idea of dark euphoria and gothic high tech, and that the 2010s will be the era of this kind of sinister turn in technology and culture where everything is just free floating. He describes it as the sensation of falling, but you don't know when you'll hit the ground. Like, is the ground even there? That when I found that, which was probably about like 7 years ago, it was just written up on Wired and I saw it referenced somewhere and I searched it, I hunted it down. But that really kind of brought to the fore this sense that I was living through an era. And it went straight to the mission I had in writing the book, which was to begin in myself and to branch outwards. So I knew that I was going through a hard time, you know, a kind of shock at all of these things around me which were accepted as normal. And I was suffering from them. And I wanted to kind of put my faith in writing, that so that I could reach out and see if other people felt the same, and if it wasn't that strange after all. That's very vague, though.
No, not at all. Not at all. No, I think you've answered it very directly there. Thanks a lot, Roisin. And so, Sophie, the same for you. How did you know the time was right to write Corpsing?
I don't know, because I don't really remember when I started writing it. I don't really think there was much of a beginning point. I'm sorry, I'm trying to shake off Roisin's answer because it's so compelling.
Yeah.
I absolutely love to disconnect, and I love that you say they have anything in common, because it's a huge compliment to Corpsing, so thank you. The first essay, I suppose, that I wrote for Corpsing that ended up being in the book was the second in the book. So it's called, actually, I can't remember what it ended up being called in the book, but it was called Grief, a Ghost Story at one point. And I didn't really think it was destined for a book. In fact, a lot of Corpsing I didn't really think was much, well, you know, use, and I didn't think it was really going to go anywhere particular. So it was kind of interesting, because usually I'm a really meticulous planner with my books. I find it's the only way I can be. So Corpsing was in every way different to the other things I've written. It just seemed to kind of surface. It's a bit like this movie I'm really obsessed with, Raising the Titanic. It's this movie that came out in the 80s, like really, really naff adventure movie about raising the Titanic. And I just love that movie. I'm really obsessed with the Titanic. And when I was a kid, I used to watch A Night to Remember, that kind of real kind of, I think it was made in the 60s, that kind of classic Titanic movie. And I watched it over and over and over between the ages of about 5 and 8. And my parents thought it was like really, really strange and unusual behavior. And then I don't know, like I didn't really set out to start talking about the Titanic now, to be honest, but I do think it's kind of interesting that it has literally jutted its way into my explanation here, which was that I think, you know, with writing creative nonfiction and stuff, you really are going, as Roisin described, inside very much, and like you're dredging, you know, and raising something, and kind of hoping, I suppose, that when you finally get it to the surface, it will give people a sense of identification, or a sense of a mirror to their lives and their experiences. So watch Raising the Titanic. It's absolutely nonsense, but very enjoyable.
Very good. I haven't seen it actually, Sophie, I have to confess, so that pleasure awaits me. So that's interesting actually, just listen to you explain that. See, it sounds like you didn't set out to write the book Corpsing, My Body and Other Horror Shows, that you were literally writing essays one by one and they just came together.
Yeah, very much. Like I had written a nonfiction book. My first book was kind of a blend of nonfiction and cookbook, and it was called Recipes for Nervous Breakdown. And it was, I just, after I wrote that, I was like, okay, absolutely never again. Like, I'm not going to touch nonfiction again. I think that's what everyone thinks when they finish a book of nonfiction. They're like, well, I'm putting that away, putting myself away for a while. So yes, I suppose as well, lots of the experiences in Corpsing were very much like happening kind of in real time. Like with Recipes for Nervous Breakdown, I was writing about a breakdown that I had after being just far too fond of drugs when I was in my early 20s. And a lot of time had elapsed then between the breakdown and actually writing about it, whereas with Corpsing, it was actually like this crazy kind of sense that I was charting these years as they were kind of unfolding. So like it started in 2017 and I wrote the last essays for it in January of 2021. So like it went all the way into the pandemic. And it's so funny because when I pitched it as an idea, I first said, oh, I think this book is all about appetites and I think it's all about consuming. And I loved your writing around that, Roisin, like with the whole Monster Energy drink essay. I was just so obsessed with. And, you know, I think as women, like we grapple a lot with our appetites. You know, it's a very charged kind of area. for women writers, I think, whether you're writing for a glossy magazine or writing a book, you know. And so I just came to Lisa and Sarah at Tramp Press and was like, oh, I have this thing, and I think it's about appetites. I think we should call it all consuming. And then it just really, really evolved over the 4 years. And like, I remember in the pitch, basically giving a sense of a trajectory for the book that I then totally just pissed out the airlock, never looked at that again. And at the end, I remember writing ending TBC and kind of like winky smiley face, because like nonfiction, you don't know where it's going. And I definitely didn't know it was veering into a pandemic.
I had the same experience. I didn't know how my book was going to end when I started writing it and when I sold it. And it was such a gamble. It's funny, like I have to keep reminding myself now, because I'm right back basically at the start all over again, except I'm trying to write fiction this time, which is less emotionally taxing. I can relate so much to what you're saying. Like, yeah, let's just put that away. The thing that I really resented as well was watching my boyfriend write and not have to fact check. Like he doesn't fact check anything ever. He doesn't ever even think about it because he doesn't need to. But I was like meticulously, you know, every argument so carefully considered and planned and sourced. And I was reading all these like scientific papers, things that I never ended up even using. But yeah, that idea of just kind of going in, and that the book is almost an act of faith that, you know, life will provide some sense of a conclusion.
Yeah. I found myself going to great lengths with finding conclusions. There is an essay in Corpsing called Craving, and it was one of the last ones added to the collection as well. And it's about how I got pregnant in the middle of writing it all. And when I was pregnant, I just had this absolute like yen for blood. I was like, nothing will do. It's the only thing I want to eat or, well, drink. Guzzle. And it was such an strange experience. And it is a real condition. It's called pica. And it's when pregnant people just, you know, they're craving something that's not really food as such, like coal or soap. And I went all over the internet looking for anyone else who'd gotten pica, all focused on blood. And it's desperate when you bring something to the internet and the internet's like, no, hun, like you're on your own with this one. I found one article that seemed to suggest it was a thing, and that article had featured in the Daily Mail. So I was like, shit, this is the only identification with this issue I'm getting. And that obviously was very hard to satisfy the blood craving. I was going all around the place to talk about research, Roshan. I was looking for like a dodgy phlebotomist and just going, look, I'll drink my own if I must. Seemed a little bit masturbatory, but sure, I'll try.
I take it you've seen Only Lovers Left Alive.
Yes. Oh my God. Well, if that's it then, you see, I went on such a bender of different kind of like hoping to try and sort of quell the craving through literally anything, rewatching like all the kind of body horror movies that have obviously somehow built my own psyche over. And even I went back to read Under the Hawthorn Tree by Marita Conlon McKenna.
Oh yes, I remember.
And that was I don't know, do you guys remember that book? Yeah, it's from when I was a kid. I loved it when I was a child. Okay. And I one night was like, I think that's where this whole craving began, because I remembered this scene in the book where they had to bleed a cow. And she had such an amazing description of them sort of bleeding this cow. Now in the book, they were bleeding the cow to rescue it. But obviously I was like, I want to bleed something for my own dark little appetites. And so anyway, I mean, look, long story short, you don't know how to finish an essay like that because it's such a huge problem. It's like by being a necrophiliac, like you're never really going to be able to, in good conscience, satisfy that urge. So I ended up getting pig's blood off the butcher on Mead Street and just having my way with it. You know, I won't go into too much detail. But
please do.
It's in the book.
You could have turned it into a very different kind of, like an article titled "My Necrophilia Shame."
Yeah, exactly. And I'm
I
so glad that
know.
this occurred while you were writing Corpsing, because I found that one of the most entertaining sections of the book. I was like, oh my
Oh,
God, you know, where
thank you.
you were, you know, feeling sympathetic towards Renfield and Bram Stoker's Dracula, and you know,
Yeah,
thinking maybe you had
What is the
Renfield
life?
syndrome. Yeah. So
absolutely.
and it's funny because it occurred to me, because you know I'd been reading about Roshan and how she'd interviewed people from subcultures, and I just thought this could be one of those subcultures, you know, these
Well,
people
it
who
completely
drink blood.
is. There's
Yeah.
a huge community of signs, they're called. They call themselves
Hmm.
signs. You probably know them, Roisin. They're all
I've
over the
heard of these
internet.
people. Yeah.
They
You've
are having
interviewed
a
these people,
high
haven't
old
you?
time in New Orleans. There's a huge community of them there. And they have donors. So they have like, they call the donors black swans. And I kept like dropping it into conversation, like real casual on the WhatsApp group with my friends, just being like, can you believe that there's actually a precedent for people just donating blood to other people and just like leaving it out there, see if any of them would bite,
Yeah.
as it were.
Wow.
But no, my friends weren't actually offering up very selfishly.
Okay. Okay, so one of the other things that I noted in both your books was the importance of time. So Roshan, you talk a lot obviously about timelines and how social media does away with the linear pattern of our lives and how it manipulates us through use of algorithms. And we were just talking there before we came on air about the first essay in your book, The Night Gym, which of course deals with this sort of after dark existence that some people may not even be aware is happening while they sleep at home in their beds. You know, you have these people working out in the gym that's open for 24 hours. So do you want to talk a little bit about that section of the book?
Yeah, I feel like there are two threads to that question. That the first is the time thing, because
Yeah.
I remember when I started to like get treatment for depression after the big kind of breakdown at the start of the book.
Mhm.
One of the things that they really stressed to us initially was this idea of like separating night and day. I think we're taking up from the vampirism of the last thing we spoke about.
Yeah.
And I guess I have vampiric tendencies in other ways. And yeah, I mean, it's funny. My parents tell me that I was an insomniac baby. You know, I just had it naturally. It's funny, lately I don't. And I think the main reason is vanity, because I just want to look well rested. And for a while I had a lovely supply of French melatonin liquid, so that's gone now, but that was amazing. That helped. But so yeah, I never really knew the importance of sleep. And the thing about the internet is it never closes for the day. And I feel as though, like, it's funny, we do have a lot of overlaps here actually, because one of the main sources I used in the Monster Energy chapter is Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, which is
Cool.
it's the turn of the century and London is being electrified and machines are taking this kind of prominence that they've never had before. And I think, you know, we're in a different version of that, where the body exists in the context of machines all the time. The body exists in the context of the unsleeping internet. And it's no coincidence to me that we're all so obsessed with productivity and with optimizing our time. Like, I'm following the Elizabeth Holmes trial right now. And, you know, there's this podcast called The Dropout that's covering it. And it talked this week about, she got very personal in her testimony. And now I am not saying sympathy for Elizabeth Holmes here. I've been very critical of her and I still will be. But I did find myself really seeing in her someone like the worst version of me, maybe. Like, she's clearly got some kind of tendency to an eating disorder. And what comes with that is an urge to have everything perfect all the time, and that this kind of deranged belief that you can plan everything, you know. Or I think of like that scene at the end of The Great Gatsby, when Gatsby's dad comes in and he has this diary that the child Gatsby made, where everything was planned out hour for hour, you know. But so if you're that kind of like, you have those obsessive tendencies, which I see in a lot of people around me who have gone into tech and also in writers, the internet is like this open invitation to just rise to the challenge, and you could potentially never sleep. And all of this kind of became it just opened up as something that I wanted to write about. Actually, accidentally. I had already started writing the book and I didn't know. And they were kind of 2 throwaway chapters that were written more out of desperation than out of planning. But I went to London and my aunt and uncle very kindly let me stay in their empty flat, which it's so nice. I was so lucky, completely for free. So I owe them one. But anyway, I had this perfect setup for doing loads of good writing and being productive, like a productivity YouTube video. And instead I just stopped sleeping. It was around this time of year and the days were getting really dark and something in my internal clock just gave out and I stopped sleeping for days and days at a time, to the point where I just felt like I was drunk all the time. And the only thing I could think about was this, why am I not sleeping? But the more I thought about it, the less I slept. And so I started thinking about that in the context of the internet, because the internet's always there for you. And then I ended up in a nap hotel, paying to sleep / type furiously into my phone, taking notes per minute. So yeah, that's one part of the time theme in my book. The other is the timeline.
Yeah.
And the year that I slightly kind of lost the plot, I guess, was 2016. 2016 is also the year of the algorithmic timeline. And I think they did this very subtly. We all got a little email, I think, saying, you know, we're changes to our policy or whatever on Instagram, Twitter. I think Facebook did it the same year as well, or maybe a bit earlier. But basically, the whole kind of concept of the timeline of it being news-based, you know, the most recent events were at the top, which was always a selling point, because these services all like to frame themselves as delivering news, you know, as well as forming communities. But that year they stopped doing that and they started showing us things which were calculated to be more likely, that we were more likely to like them and interact with them, and everyone was getting their own version of the timeline. And when I thought about that, to me it reminds me of, in dictatorships, one of the main signs of that you're in a dictatorship is that they're trying to control time. So you have like Pyongyang time or, you know, the Julian calendar. But to me, there's something so fundamental about time. You know, I'm sorry, I'm throwing a lot of references out, but the other one that comes to mind for me is Slaughterhouse-Five. And, you know, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. I think I came unstuck in time, and I think all of us did. And that makes, you know, that kind of environment is what allows things like fake news to happen, because knowing when something happened is one of the key elements to knowing that it's real. So it was just another step in the mass collective delusion of the internet that we're all in together, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What you're kind of saying reminds me of the Mandela effect quite a lot there as well, because those are, you know, I suppose, how would you describe them, Roshan, for anyone who kind of isn't familiar? It's sort of like collective memory of an event that never took place. So one of the big, it's named after people saying they remember the death of Nelson Mandela happening in, I think it was the late 80s, and that's not the case. But like so many people just kind of like collectively seem to remember this. And it was, it's always, it's a touchstone in the argument for we're living in a simulation, which is a pet story of mine, or a pet kind of daydream of mine.
Do you believe?
I kind of believe that, I suppose, what we are living in is this cacophony of personal perspectives, all like just ricocheting around a space and time together. And I think that you can make an argument that you're living in a simulation, or you're living just in a reality that is so mediated by yourself that, you know, that we've basically been in echo chambers since long before they coined the phrase. So I guess, like, in ways I like to think of it like that. I also always remember, like, just that idea of, like, when you touch things, that your molecules mingle and things like that. I've always really liked thinking about those kind of, I suppose, systems that lie far deep under anything we can see or perceive. So in that way, I just like believing stuff sometimes. I just think, like, it's definitely more interesting. And then also definitely, I think, in a way, like, real life is so batshit bananas that I genuinely do start to think, well, the simulation seems about as believable as, you know, a reality star one day running America, or us
I'm
being
waiting
locked
for
into
President
pandemic.
RuPaul.
Yes, yes. I'm waiting for President Conroy from Succession.
Naturally,
I think that's going to
naturally.
happen. Yeah, or like Kieran Culkin is going to be president next. So yeah. But it's funny, I hadn't thought about how recent that switch to the algorithm was, because obviously we're so just like completely, you know, breathing it like oxygen now at this point, like taking it for granted. But you're right, it's so recent. Like,
I find it so
Yeah.
fascinating that like hologram theory, hologram universe theory has such a following in our times. Like I used to kind of laugh at it, and then I started researching it for writing recently, and it's very compelling. And the further you go into quantum physics, now the problem with quantum physics is we're all fascinated by it, but it's so complex that it, like, even the people who, you know, apparently are experts in it tell you that they don't understand it. So invoking quantum physics doesn't really actually mean anything. But like, I think there's a reason why we find the many worlds interpretation so compelling, and maybe it's regress, maybe it's possibility. The hologram universe one, which isn't quantum physics, it's more like computing almost, isn't it, or philosophical question, like a quandary. But to me it says something, like, aside from just finding it fascinating and speaking to our own sense of derealization that maybe all of us experience at various times, the other side of it is that technology is kind of approaching becoming a god. I just finished, like, I don't want it to be that way. I think we should be very, you know, wary of techno solutionism in everyday life, but it's making scary leaps within our lifetimes. And I just finished reading Dune last week.
Ooh.
And I keep thinking, will we get to a Butlerian jihad in our lifetimes? Will we have the god technology, and then we'll have the Bene Gesserit come along and like take over instead? I can only
Roshan, you sound so excited about this. You know?
all ahead of us.
Funny, Sophie, I have a quote here actually from Corpsing, where you're talking about technology and time. And you said the digital age has further removed any physical connection between time and the human experience. We experience time as a loading bar rather than a physical action. So do you want to maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I suppose in a kind of in a funny way, I'm kind of like your opposite, Roisin, because I feel like you have this like really lovely, healthy glee about about the disconnect. And I think I am obsessed with making time kind of corporal, or sort of, you know, giving it a substance. And I think the reason that became a particular fixation for me was that I had my first breakdown when I was about 22, and I had drug-induced psychosis. And so it's funny actually, because it all really ties into what we were just talking about, and probably why I'm so ready to believe any old thing you'll throw at me, except QAnon. I will not. But it's because a lot of my breakdown really manifested as these kind of hallucinatory kind of experiences. I had a lot of visual disturbances and auditory hallucinations, and I was like 22. And just,
this was, you had taken a drug at a festival, wasn't it, at a music festival, Sophie, and had a really bad reaction to it?
Yeah. So it was also quite a kind of switch flipping moment in my life. Like, it's very much a watershed. As I said, I was a little enthusiastic about drugs when I was kind of in college and stuff, and like I was always thinking I was quite moderate, but also now I'm like, I don't think there's any such thing. It's such a roll of the dice with each person. And I think maybe now, after many years, I think my breakdown probably would have happened regardless, but I definitely exacerbated it, shall we say. And so a big part of my sort of delusions were all focused around nothing is real, and that I wasn't real, my memories were false, the people in my life were kind of stand-ins. It's real classic kind of delusion stuff, actually. Like, it's real kind of delusions 101. But I suppose that it's such a kind of really like powerful fear in us, I guess, that we're alone completely, and that we have totally imagined you know, our lives. Like, I think it's actually, it's the kind of the nightmare that we kind of, you know, that we kind of, I suppose that you could fall into and become quite convinced of if you're mentally ill, which I was. And so I think I was coming out of the breakdown, and it was funny because the thing is, when you're really sick in your head, there is so little sense that you'll ever be right again. Like, it's so bleak. It's just very, very isolating. And I just wanted to be normal. I didn't even want to be well. I just wanted to like just not have this cacophony of like fear and delusion and spiraling thoughts. Like and talk about productive, like I could get nothing. Oh God, I just couldn't do anything. I was so paralyzed by it. And everywhere I turned, really, people said, oh, it'll take time. These things take time. And I think that's where my obsession started, with trying desperately to pass the time. Because I think when you're really sick, you're just trying to like knit together the moments. Just to get like from minute to minute, when you're really sick, it's like from second to second, just trying to hold on and trying to just tolerate it, because mental illness is really painful and frightening. Like, it is such a heightened state of just relentless terror. Like, I think that's the terrible thing about depression, is that it kind of builds as this kind of sad thing. And it's like, I don't know, it's sad sometimes, but it's really terrifying a lot of the time. And such an unbearable state, fear. So that's why I was very obsessed with time from then on, trying to make it pass. I did a lot of like kind of, after I was well enough, after a few years, I was kind of well enough to sort of like, have a job and stuff like that, and be independent again. I didn't really like, I was very careful with how I lived, because my sanity felt very tenuous, and I could still kind of have backslide. And I think that's the thing with kind of recovery and with mental illness, that it's just, you kind of progress, and then you can just like swoop backwards and think, oh, this again, I'll never be free of it, and it's very disheartening. And so, I did a lot of like just hiking and cycling, and like this weird kind of opting out nearly of the kind of like time framework, as it were. Like, I lived in a van for a while, and I kind of just cycled around France and Spain, and I worked seasonally, and I didn't bother with the internet. I only got a phone in 2016, Roshan. It's one of my little quirks. And now I'm so online, like I just live there. And it's so funny, I just didn't even know what the Daily Mail sidebar was until like 2016. No social media, no nothing. And it was actually amazing, and I'm really grateful I had that time. And then like, I suppose now these days, I think things like writing actually is a really big action of time passing and placing words in front of words, and just like, as Anne Lamott says, bird by bird, and just kind of moving through the harder times in our lives, the good times. It's the same with grief. Like, after my dad died in 2017, I hadn't really expected grief to be so painful. I hadn't expected it to be so physically, just this physical drudgery that I had to just get through, just tap out the hours of it. And I got very into knitting. I'm glancing down here because my main knitting project is here at the moment. But I got very into knitting and crafts and things like that, because that is such an amazing way of bringing time into our space and seeing it and kind of regarding it. So this is like, actually, when I look at it, I'm like, this is the third draft of my current novel. Like, I'm going to see it and be like, it's haunted by the angst of trying to finish this novel. It's a cardigan.
It's a cardigan.
It's a cardigan for my friend. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Oh my God, that's so nice.
Yeah, thank you. They're her choice. I just do commissions because I knit so much that, like, I just had to start doing it for other people, because my husband, I remember my husband just like about a year ago was like, you need to get some of this knitwear out of the house. I feel like we're living in like a fluff apocalypse. And he has a beard, and while he was saying it, I could actually see some yarn in his beard, and I was like, fair.
I find that so interesting what you were saying there about time though and mental health, because
Mm.
so I'm doing therapy right now again, since I haven't done it since I think it was 2016 when I
Okay.
was in treatment. And one of the things that like I'm being told to do, and I do it, I try it, like practicing as a kind of form of meditation, is just counting. It's just like kind of stretching and
Mm.
counting and like calming myself down by counting. And it's kind of something that I did already sometimes. If I was like on a really mad night out, I would often just go and hide somewhere and just count to 10 or something. I don't know, but it is like time is the number one source of uncertainty, I feel, like the sense of not being able to see the future. And I got really interested in reading like basically neuroscience on perception of time. There was this book that I used as a really like interesting, just as a source when I was writing The Disconnect, called Adventures in Memory. But like
Yeah.
apparently when you're experiencing certain forms of depression, you lose the ability to imagine the future. And to me, that's such a fundamentally important thing, like in a political sense, in a personal sense, and as a writer too, you know, it's a failure of the imagination, but it's something that can take hold very quickly and becomes terrifying, like you said,
Mm. Mm.
deeply, deeply destabilizing.
Yeah. And so just on that note, actually, Roisin, you know, thinking about the fact that it was this, you know, this sort of losing yourself in time and immersing yourself in technology that actually led to you going to therapy in the first place. How did you emerge from that kind of dark period of your life? How did you come out the other side of that?
Oh, it takes ages, just like Sophie was saying. Like
Yeah.
it's and the thing is, yeah, and also like what Sophie, like what you were saying there, I think we're used to the modern version of, in fiction and in film, the glamorous woman who dies very cleanly of tuberculosis, who just like looks very glamorous and wan
Mm, mm.
and then dies. But the modern equivalent is the mentally ill woman who never seems to cause trouble, just gets depressed and sad and then just like dies by suicide or something. Like it's not like that. It's more just you have to take care of yourself and you have to learn to actually prioritize taking care of yourself. I mean, this is some stuff that a lot of people will just know naturally, but it's the basics first. Stuff like sleeping and eating well and getting exercise. And then, so another area that fascinates me and that I'm writing about at the moment is work culture, because
Mm.
there are so many, you know, there's so much messaging coming from culture right now, specifically targeted at, I think, millennials. And I'm sure that they've moved on to preying on Gen Z now and even whoever's below that. But, you know, and it's at everyone really up to a point. But the millennial thing has a particular economic dimension that is particularly cruel, I feel. But it's that idea that, you know, you'll never work enough. You'll never be enough.
Yeah.
And if you're a freelancer and you've always worked from home, I think a lot of people had to suddenly adjust to this when the pandemic started, but there's no divide between work
Mm.
and off time. It could
Yeah.
potentially just go on forever. So you have to learn to be greedy in that, like, actually not greedy way, just that healthy, like, this is my life, I'm going to preserve it way, which I still, by the way, have not mastered. There are certain things I'm good at, but other things I work in very haphazard kind of bouts of work, and then I don't work, and then I work like crazy again. And it's, if anything, it's actually got worse since the book came out.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
so that was one aspect of it, you know, and there are many others. I think I just by nature I'm quite extreme, and there are now, because of the culture we're in, there are all these open invitations to embrace extremism. It sounds like I'm about to join ISIS. But, other kinds of extremism. And yeah, relearning the basics and then maintaining that, you know, on a level. Writing, in particular, the essay form, which was this preoccupation of mine for a really long time. And I think I'm kind of moving on to longer forms of writing now, but the essay form, I think, is just wonderful for learning about yourself, and gaining perspective on yourself, because you get to freeze yourself in time. And that's kind of agonizing because it's like, you know, seeing yourself on camera or something. But then you get to just approach a point in time from every angle and explore it and contextualize it in the wider world and unravel all the tangled factors which lead us to act completely impulsively often, or sometimes it feels like we're not even acting under our own control, you know. And it doesn't change the world immediately, but it has so many other benefits. I think we always jump straight to like, I write to make the world a better place. It's like, that's very optimistic, and I wouldn't criticize someone for believing that, but really like my main kind of goals are kind of humbler than that. It's more just making sense in some small way of the moment that I'm living in, and making sense of human tendencies. And, you know, it has worked. It has helped me to gain perspective. It's funny because like here I am talking about my obsession with the internet. I can't say I have much of an obsession with the internet anymore. It's all, I don't know, it's kind of out of my system now, you know.
Did the book kind of exercise it?
Yeah. Did you find that as well?
With the internet?
No, with what you write about.
Yeah.
Oh.
Was it therapeutic, Sophie?
No, I don't think so. I find that it's like it's like work, isn't it? It's more work. That's like, do you find that funny? Like if you write anything kind of nonfiction, I think particularly as a woman, there's like, we all go to this thought of like, is it therapy for you? And like I'm the same, like, and then I just think it's funny. I don't know, do we ask men that question as much? But
maybe we can't face what it is men might be exercising in their fiction.
Yeah, no, I think maybe the first draft probably was a bit of an exorcism, and then obviously after that I think it becomes much more like considered in every way. I think like, you know, it's so crafted that with every draft and every time I work over it, it becomes more and more fixed and its own thing, and I feel really detached myself by the end of anything like that. Like people have, like, I think the most common question, or certainly like the first question everyone asks about corpsing is, oh, did you feel really vulnerable, or you're, you know, divulging? And I'm going, what's in it? Like, is it bad? Should I?
Yeah. Okay.
But you know, it's just, I just think that you get really detached, and I'm sure like you find it as well with your fiction as well, Tanya, like that it just becomes such a separate part. Like it just becomes so not you anymore, or it does for me. Like I think of it very much like it's not, you know, with creative nonfiction, I don't believe that you're seeking to represent facts, or certainly not with something like corpsing. That's not my ambition for it. Like I see it much more as like akin to kind of portrait painting, in that like I'm looking at a subject, whether it's, you know, whether it's alcoholism, or whether it's grief, or just drinking blood, and I'm trying to, you know, create a separate sort of piece from it that is, you know, I'm certainly looking at the source, but I'm interpreting it, and it is, you know, such a kind of, you know, it's a wily document. It's not, I mean, there's no lies, but it's so, you know,
it's very interesting actually.
subjective.
So because while you're talking about that, it sort of occurs to me that, you know, it's not so different from writing fiction in many ways, you know, because the creative non-fiction writer is using the same skills or the same tools as the fiction writer, because it's not just non-fiction, it is creative non-fiction. And I wrote an article, it was in the Times last week, about using truth in fiction.
I actually read that, and it was absolutely wonderful.
Because thinking of, you know, I was thinking a lot about this lately, and I gave a class on it, because most of my stories would have some element of truth, whether it's something big or whether it's something tiny, like I'm just familiar with the setting or the landscape or something like that. But for instance, I mean, there's a story in my new collection which is about a couple living in an apartment block who have a psychotic neighbour who begins making death threats. And this actually happened to me. So this story, you know, people were horrified after they read it, but I kind of said to people, well, you know, actually that story is 90% true, you know.
Oh my God.
There's a lot of fiction brought in, and
were you
the characters? Yeah.
Were you the couple, or were you the neighbour?
No, I was the psychotic neighbor. No, I'm joking.
I can see it in your eyes.
Yeah, you can. I know. I can't hide it. No, myself and David had a really traumatic experience there a few years ago.
That's unbelievable.
The guy living directly next to us here in the apartment block, he basically had a type of breakdown, but it manifested itself in violence. You know, he became very aggressive. And he was shouting and screaming all night, and we had to kind of go to the management company in the apartment block and say, look, we can't sleep and we have to look for work in the morning, and what can we do about this man? And how it basically all happened was the guy in the management company said, oh look, I'll have a chat with him. And I was thinking, as soon as he said that, oh God, this is going to make things worse, because he's going to know it was us who complained about him. And that's exactly what happened, you know. So he started making death threats and all sorts, but that found its way into my fiction. So I think that the truth will always out in fiction as well. So in some ways, you know, there is a lot in common. It's just that I choose to use the event to inspire my fiction. You know, and then I bring in all the fictional strands. Obviously, like the couple in the story are nothing like myself and David. They're totally made up characters, you know. The neighbor who doesn't meet a good end in the story, that's fictional too. But it you know, they're not worlds apart, you know, writing short stories and writing essays, you know, it really isn't worlds apart. By the way, I'll just take this opportunity to say to anybody who's watching that we have our little Q&A down the bottom of the screen there. If anybody has a question for Roshan or for Sophie, if you could put it into the Q&A rather than in the chat, and we'll come to those a little bit later on. I see we already have a few comments coming in, which is great. Just to get back to you guys there, in relation to some of those overlaps in the books. I mean, addiction, as you mentioned already, you talked a little bit about that, Sophie. You know, addiction is a theme in both books. And, you know, when you think about it, I mean, you know, somebody can be addicted to drugs, they can be addicted to alcohol. But I'm sure you'd probably agree, Roshan, that an addiction to the internet is probably far more prevalent, I would say, these days. You know, I would say we have a far greater number of people who are addicted to the internet than possibly are addicted to substances.
It's such a slippery thing, isn't it? Like, how do you define addiction? Because I remember hearing it, that the definition that it only can be really classed as an addiction when it starts to interrupt with your life. And that's, in the context of the internet, that's really, really hard to pinpoint. I mean, I was talking a minute ago about Elizabeth Holmes's trial. Like, that to me highlights what she was doing was being the perfect Silicon Valley entrepreneur. It's just the fact that she was dealing with people's blood, another connection, which you know, which made it all a problem and illegal. But so many of the behaviors, like, this is why I think it's funny and entertaining, but it's also actually useful to analyze figures like Mark Zuckerberg and Dorsey. And, you know, the most recent, I wrote an essay about Jeff Bezos going to space for Tulka. It's coming out soon, called Jeff Bezos Talks to God. But like, these people, for no clear reason, are getting to, you know, dictate our reality. Essentially, I know that they have teams of UX designers and psychologists, for that matter, and people who make slot machines working for them at their disposal. But yeah, you know, it is worth thinking about that. Like, one thing I'm starting to really realize and learn over life is that normal isn't, I mean, really, there is no such thing as normal, right? You know, it's different for every person, and every person will be comfortable with a different degree of, you know, alcohol or you know, even like relationships or food or whatever it is. Like, you know, it will suit them in a certain way and it won't suit another person, and that might create a problem. But the internet is one where I think those standards of an apparently normal, successful person are really forced on us more than anywhere. To me, it's like a kind of unholy fusion of, you know, tabloid news culture 10 years ago with addictive, like kind of deliberately addictive engines baked in, completely accessible, like no barriers to entry. It's funny because I sometimes listen to myself and I'm like, I sound like the way people talked about video games in the 80s. Like, I don't want to be that person. And I'm certainly not a Luddite. People seem to think I'm like, people will be like, saw you using Twitter the other day, you hypocrite. And I'll be like, you know, No, I got people coming at me for using, well, like not really coming at me, but criticizing me for using an app to learn about plants called PlantNet.
Okay.
They're like, why are you, ruining the experience of nature with plants? And I'm like, no, I'm using it as an educational tool so I can better
Yeah.
appreciate the plants. Like
Uh-huh.
technology is not inherently bad, nor is it inherently good. It's the people, who make it addictive. But I think I'm an extreme example in that I turned basically food into an addiction and kind of control into an addiction early in life. So and after that, you don't give up food, you have to learn to eat. So I was coming at it from kind of a lifetime of experience with kind of compulsive behavior, and then I was starting to see it all around me. So yeah, addiction is it's definitely a framework for understanding our relationship to technology today, but that's not to say that it's going to be the same for everyone. It's just about knowing yourself. That's the big, giant, scary challenge and the lifelong project, isn't it?
Yeah.
I did some research around the treatment of internet addiction for my second novel, particularly because in the novel there was a character who was just compulsively catfishing people online. And I'm obsessed with catfishers. I love them. They're my favorite type of story to procrastinate with. And
Filter This, Sophie, was it? The novel?
yeah, and Unfiltered is the and it was so interesting because there was proper residential treatment facilities for online addiction and gaming. They seem to be the two real kind of more developed kind of areas in treating internet addiction, was like gaming particularly. And I feel like social media, maybe it's just like coming up the rear a bit. Like I didn't find as much that was like so focused, but these were like treatment centers where treatment cost like 30 grand. And there was so many young men. It was just like young guys in their early 20s in this facility. And like, it was so interesting because obviously I was looking at it probably like very much through, my kind of prism of like alcoholism, particularly. And the similarities were unreal, like in that, and I'm sure that I'm sure you both will understand this basically, but particularly around food is such a kind of, I don't know, like source of angst. Certainly for me as well, like I really related, Roshan. And it is, it's so isolating. Like that's just what's, I think, whenever I come up against friends with eating disorders or watching these young guys in their care centers, or me just like going through recovery from alcoholism and obviously going through being active in my addiction, the isolation of it is just, there's nothing touches it in terms of just how completely cut off you are. Because I think when you're in addiction, your entire being, your entire remit for life is protecting the addiction. So like you have to apply like every ounce of your mental capacity into kind of managing it, controlling it, and keeping it safe, and keeping everyone else away so that they can't stop you or intervene. And I think that it is the same like across the board. I have several friends who have been treated for eating disorders, and when we talk about their recovery and my recovery from alcoholism is so similar. It's wild, except as Roshan pointed out, it's just unfair that people suffering from eating disorders can't abstain. Like it's so complex that you have to completely reshape your relationship. I often think how lucky I am that I can just not,
Yeah, I relate so much to what you're saying about the loneliness, and I think that does have that broader application to online life, because so much of it fundamentally hinges on loneliness. And I think like if we were to somehow magically bring someone from like 50 years ago forward into the now and explain it, that might be one of the things they instantly remarked on. Like it was just obvious. You're staring at other people's lives and seeing these like often filtered versions of their lives, and you're always scrolling alone. Like
Yeah.
gaming at least has a social like quality to it, you know?
Yeah.
They're actually quite communal in a way, like, but just being on social media, it's the opposite of social. Like, it's really not social at all, right down to the fact that, like, anyone I know, and I guess some people will be like, why do you even know these people? But anyone I know who has extreme opinions on the internet, they do not practice that stuff in real life, which is where you get into that whole kind of rabbit hole tendency.
Hiding behind the screen,
And of radicalization of people in really scary ways, where they're actually being lured into a fiction, you know, a kind of idea of a utopia or something, or of some sort of glorious death, where, and I think it comes back to, Sophie, what you were saying about embodying time, because, like, I always think of this quote, it's like from John Mulaney stand-up, who I think himself has had a lot of issues with addiction, where
yeah, he's not doing great.
No, it doesn't look, yeah, I haven't been following the latest.
Oh my God, talk about rabbit holes. Like,
Oh, really?
I never even heard of him until he got Olivia Munn pregnant. Sorry, this is like sidebar and celebrity gossip.
Okay.
But even the way we consume those fables, though, you know, are so interesting to me, you know.
Oh, same. But he said this line, my body is just a thing that carries my head from room to room. And at my worst, that would be me, definitely. And it comes so readily. And I see so much online that encourages that kind of disembodiment, like that kind of strange vertigo that sets in when you spend too much time scrolling on Twitter, or the fact that, like, and this is all very Kundalini, but like that the mind is stronger than the body. Like, there is something good in that, but the fact that, like, you can actually just completely ignore the mind-body connection and just live online,
or treat it as something that is at odds, like a mind that can impose its will on the body, is a strange concept.
Productivity, 24-hour gyms, you know. And things like, I mean, I know on Instagram you have spectacular videos of the pole, the pole. I do yoga, which is less exciting, but like anything that just gets you back in your body is the cure for the internet to me. Like,
I agree. Yeah, I find the pole dancing is so good for just turning my mind off. Like, it's amazing, and it's very. I feel like I only just started learning, really, and I'd never before was able to dance or do anything like that. And I really found it amazing for kind of suspending time, is that being moving with intention. You're only thinking about what you've just done and what you're about to do. It's very in the moment. It's like a release from the kind of trajectory that I think, you know, you're talking about with the productivity, Roshan, that like we're just constantly forced down this kind of narrow momentum. And I think to kind of do stuff like dancing, or like I just do a lot of those kinds of things like dancing, knitting. I've just started roller skating. I think things like that really help us play. And I find that like, to come back to writing, like I find all of those things really support my writing. Like I came out of art college when I was 22, and I just saw such a kind of delineation between like real life, where I had to have my job as a waitress and I had to make money and all this kind of stuff. That was my real life. And then I had this creative life, and I didn't know how they would work together. And it's only as I've kind of gotten older and started to be a lot freer with all of the stuff I make, I've allowed them to kind of commingle, you know, and kind of accepted that like sometimes I'm going to find expression in pole dancing, sometimes I'm going to find expression in writing an essay, you know. And it's been really freeing, like it's been really liberating. And I think it is all about I think opting out of the kind of the force and the kind of willing ourselves forward. And I think it is a privilege to opt out of it too. You know, and I think it's something along the lines of finding that balance of opting in and opting out.
I totally agree with you, Sophie. I mean, I think, you know, obviously we all love writing and reading, but you do need other activities, don't you, that are completely different. Like my big passion would be music. I play ukulele and I absolutely love that, you know, and it's something totally different, you know. You're talking about pole dancing. For a good few years I was obsessed with Zumba fitness. I absolutely loved it.
Cool.
Yeah, I was thinking while you were talking as well, there should be a Strictly Come Dancing for writers. How cool would that be?
Yeah.
We could all go on that show. It'd be great.
I call the
know.
voguing category.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I find I end up writing all of my little current obsessions into whatever I'm writing. Like
Yeah.
especially my fiction, like I'd be very particularly the book I'm working on at the moment has this fictional musical, and I'm a huge musical theatre person. Loved it all since my dad sort of introduced me when I was a kid, and I love it. I actually find it the most pure art form. I'm like, no, screw writing. Musical theatre is like the true way to communicate the human experience through dance and song, the way we intended, the way nature intended, but unfortunately I don't have the talent. And so I am writing, for example, this character who's in a musical. The fictional musical is about Ireland's Eurovision streak of the early 90s, and like I think we get fits of obsession as writers, and it all comes out somewhere, and like, you know, then your editor has to be like, have you been watching a lot of Eurovision on YouTube, Sophie? And I'd be like, yeah. Like, might pull it back. We pull it back. Like, you're the only person who really knows this level of detail about Michael Flatley in 1994. So yeah, it's I think we're prone to whims and obsessions.
I can't let that go without asking Roshan, what are the guilty pleasures, Roshan?
There's yoga. It's funny because I'm just looking at the chat bar and it's talking about what Sophie mentioned at the beginning about raising the Titanic. And when you brought that up, I was going to say, do you ever watch deep sea videos?
Yeah.
I'm obsessed with deep sea videos, and I watch, and lately, like squids, obviously, octopuses, reading about like animal consciousness in general. Like I'm obsessed with the laws around boiling lobsters. Like Rob is on this, I think, and he's listening, but like a few days ago, all I really wanted to think about was this woman in Maine who gives weed to her lobsters before she kills them. So I've been like a veggie all my life. So to me, it's like a guiltless kind of odd fascination because I don't actually eat the lobsters myself. But so I spend a lot of time considering the lobster. And I also play video games, actually. Yeah. I used to sew things. I actually need to, listening to you talk, it's making me want to get back into crochet. I was going to make like do a whole series of squids, but I might sew them instead. I need like something really diaphanous to do justice to.
Oh, gorgeous.
Yeah.
Tulle, maybe. Set up an Etsy.
With wire inside it to give the structure.
Yeah, you could kind of bend it. That'd be cool.
I've basically been collecting rare squids, not the real ones, but just the knowledge of these squids for years now. And now I'm really into slow-mo videos of insects taking flight.
Oh, fab.
Yeah.
Honestly, I spent an hour today reading like reviews of Lego. I don't know if you've seen that Lego has brought out a new set where you can make a typewriter. It's one of those like very complex Lego sets that's for like enthusiasts, for adults. And the reviews on the Lego site are just so charming. I just adored them. I think it's actually that I just get so attracted to anyone who's got like a real passion for anything. Like as long as you're just passionate about it, I really want to hear about it, you know? Yeah. So these Lego reviews, oh my God, they touched my heart. Like one of them starts this guy saying, hats off to the Lego engineers for turning a great idea into an excellent kit. Really captures the spirit of a typewriter. I just adore it. Oh, hello.
There we go.
Favorite from my childhood.
It's all coming out tonight.
I'm an old school Lego child. It's a beautiful thing, Lego. It's pure, you know.
It is. Yeah. I'm going to bring it right back, girls, for a moment, because soon we'll go to the questions. Sorry, I'm party pooper, I know, because I have so many questions. I'm just thinking I want to get through a few more before we go to our audience, who are hopefully still with us and not building Lego. So you mentioned there earlier, Sophie, you know, just when you wrote Corpsing, people were saying to you, basically, did you have any qualms about revealing such personal information? And there are a lot of dark moments in the book, but there's also a lot of funny moments, and there's also a lot of humor. But just to wind back to some of those bleaker moments, you were talking about alcoholism, and I'd asked Roshan there earlier in the conversation, how did she emerge from that dark period before she wrote The Disconnect? And you were talking about containing things, Sophie, and how did you manage to emerge from this alcohol addiction? Because it's certainly no easy thing to do.
Yeah. Well, so I guess I got sober, touch wood, in 2018, in like April. And I think what happened for me was that I just got so wrung out and exhausted by the addiction. And I think especially in the last kind of 6 months of it, I had just really lost any will to try anymore to manage it in any kind of reasonable way. I think, like a lot of people, had rules, had all these rules that I didn't drink before 6, and then before 5, and then lunchtime, and then like it just became so just painful. And also it started to feel like a pursuit that was never ever going to arrive anywhere. Like, I think I just felt like I was always searching for the exact right amount of alcohol that would kind of just make me feel just right. And I think that's the funny thing about addiction. And it's funny because I'm watching an amazing show at the moment called Dope Sick. It's about the OxyContin epidemic in the States. And they describe the kind of withdrawal process as, and those kind of lows between hits, as agony for the addict, because their body feels wrong when the drug isn't in their body. And what you're pursuing is, it's not like decadent fun. You're pursuing a kind of very baseline of just feeling okay. And it becomes extremely skewed and toxic, because the thing that's making you feel okay is killing you as well. And so I was always pursuing this exact right kind of formula, I think, of alcohol, and kind of numbing. And I just needed to turn down the volume on life at all times. I actually went for years thinking that everyone felt this way, that everyone needed to numb life. And then I kind of started to understand, actually, no, like, definitely not everyone lives just trying to get from one drink to the next, or one pill or whatever. And so I remember kind of basically on one of the last nights that I was drinking, I just really just decided, I kind of got to the edge and just said, I'm going to jump tonight, and I'm just going to find the bottom of this thing. Like, I remember having this sense of literally searching for the kind of the boundaries of this appetite, and just trying to find the bottom, and trying to find the sides, and trying to fill it, and feel some sense of being sated and being right. And at that night, I just was just on the, I don't know, just it was just a frightening realization that there was no end to it. This thing would never end, and it was like the horizon. Like, every time I'd think I was getting closer, it would be further out of reach. And that next day, I was just hungover. At the time, I used to always, like, in the mornings, take Solpadeine or Valium if I had some. Like, I was never without something, and that was just the only way I knew to be at that time. And like, I really did look quite fine in many ways. I mean, I had a lot of boxes ticked. I had a home, I had 2 kids, I had a career, but I think like I in corpsing, the title refers to me trying to maintain that appearance and being a kind of trussed up corpse, you know, always makeup, always perfume, always chewing gum, always all the little things to hide the decay and the rot. So yeah, that was one of my last nights of drinking, and the next day I remember having this really kind of strong sort of sense, this kind of just a moment of clarity that was just like, how low do you want to go? Because this is only going one direction. And just feeling very, very wrung out and very hopeless.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So,
And
sorry.
so yeah, no, thanks for talking to us about that, Sophie. Because as I say, there are a lot of very personal moments in this book. And one of the others that really struck me, because I suppose we've seen so many cases that you know haven't had a happy ending in the last few years. And you know, you describe a scene in corpsing where you didn't trust yourself not to harm yourself or your children. And you have this very, you know, effective scene in the book where you're thinking about the fact that there's so many knives down in the kitchen. And you have this compulsion that you just want to go down to the kitchen and get all the knives and throw them out the window and get them out of the house. I mean, that was so striking for me, just thinking about all the awful cases, you know, that have ended, say, in infanticide in Ireland in the last few years. I mean, every time you hear about a case like this, you must think, gosh, you know, thank goodness I wasn't taken down that path, you know.
Yeah, I feel very close to those things when they take place. I actually do think a lot of women do, because I think that the whole landscape after you have children is just so altered. And I mean, there's you know, all these kind of interesting thoughts around the kind of transition from, like, you know, personhood into motherhood. And you know, it's a very volatile period of time to, you know, just get through. I mean, it's so funny because it brings in so many different things that, like Roshan talking about the no sleep, like this is a strange quirk of human biology that you will entrust the most helpless creature into the care of somebody who is so compromised by lack of sleep. At its most basic, in the best case scenario, when everything's going fine and nobody is suffering from mental illness, they are suffering from sleep deprivation, and also a sense of grief about what has just taken place. Because no matter how longed for a baby might be, there is still this just absolute upheaval, like there's no point in trying to prepare anyone for it. I'm always like, oh, people are like, what's it like? And I'm like, okay, so I would put on Underworld's Born Slippy at full volume, and then I'd try and ride a unicycle while somebody just throws marshmallows at you. And that's kind of what motherhood's like. You know, it's just so hard to communicate the absolute chaos of it. And then obviously, you know, I am bipolar now, is the diagnosis that I have for that kind of has given a bit of has put sense on the last 15 years for me, because obviously I've had just cycles of mania and crash and mania and crash. So it was interesting finally getting a diagnosis like kind of late, like 35, and kind of helped to make sense of a lot of what I'd experienced. But like the thing is that it is like really particularly frightening being a mentally ill parent, because you're actually the God. Like, you talk about Jeff talking to God, but like you're the God of these children in a really horrible, like scary way. And so, you know, I've definitely, you know, had times where I've just been feeling the delusions come on, and I feel very lucky because I've been sick for so long in a way, or sick. I mean, you know, I've experienced so many episodes that I'm actually better at kind of sort of sensing the onset. And I've been really lucky that I still have mostly retained some kind of perspective that is enough to let me know that the things are not right. Like these thoughts, like I think with that passage in the book, I think there's describing an episode back in 2018 where I was starting down the road of thinking I was possessed. And as I said in the book, it's really hard to bring that thought to people. Like it's just not one you can kind of casually deliver over brunch. And I mean, I went to the GP. That was great. But you know, I had enough clarity to just say, I don't think it's great that you think you're possessed right now. So let's try and get you like to not be in charge of these children for a while. But like say with the case of Deirdre Morley that was in the courts earlier this year, I did write an essay about that, because from the start of her story, which is such a tragedy, I did feel like this real connection with her, and just a real sense of empathy. Like I did feel a lot of people express disbelief around those kinds of extreme events, and I just feel I understood. Like I could see I'd seen the start of that road, you know. And so I wrote that essay, and it was actually interesting because I felt such an overwhelming sort of sense from people who read it and people who wrote to me that a lot of people have seen the start of that road, you know. And it's just so why we have to just get so serious about treatment in this country.
And I suppose, you know, you mentioned as well, Sophie, that that's one of the good things about the internet, that a lot of people are not afraid to, you know, go on Facebook and say, I'm having a really bad time right now, to talk about their mental health problems.
It's quite interesting.
So that is one of the interesting things, I think. You know, like you said, you were suffering mental health problems, you know, in a time before we had this, in a time before people would talk about it.
Yeah, like 2006, 2007 was my first breakdown, and it definitely was, it just felt very alien. I just really had rarely seen anyone talk about it. Even the internet was quite shit at the time. I think even then I wouldn't have had a computer, for example. Like I would have used the computers in college or something. So like even just looking for other experiences is kind of hard. I got better though, definitely better and better at finding those amazing writers who kind of have documented those kind of experiences. But actually it's interesting because you were bringing up that kind of thing of people sort of documenting their illness narrative on social media, and actually that reminded me of Trick Mirror, which really reminds me of The Disconnect, Roshan, in like the way that Gia Tolentino talks about how we perform ourselves online and things like that. And that really struck me in The Disconnect as well.
I deliberately didn't read Trick Mirror because
from
the very get-go, people started telling me that it sounded like I was writing something like Trick Mirror. And I'd read her essay.
They're cousins. They're not.
I read one or two. Like I really liked her essay on the personal essay industrial complex and the Instagram space. That's really interesting to me, and it's true. Like I agree with it. But I didn't read the book for that reason, and I probably could read it now. Like there's no reason not to now. But you know, when you're just scared to let something get into your consciousness in that way, that like you might think that you didn't have your own idea.
Yeah.
Am I having delusions now? Because I've had my fair share of delusions. But she's in my brain. No. But what were you talking about before that? Sorry, I get like very troubled by Gia Tolentino's mention.
Well, I was going to ask you, Roisin, with your breakdown, did you share about it on the internet?
Oh, personal writing in the internet, right? Yeah, endless wellspring of things to say here. No, you know what, it's really funny. I was really, really scared of writing personally for a long time. And I kind of was very po-faced about it because like we were in what Gia Tolentino has written about, the personal essay kind of peak, you know, of it happened to me, those, and I read a ton of them. And I was a big fan of like Kat Marnell, you know, and there is always, and I think this sort of alludes to maybe what you were talking about being this kind of, you know, this dressed up corpse or a load of cats in a trench coat, as I sometimes see myself. You know, there is a sort of monstrous feminine energy going on with that, where it's like, you made us this culture, you know, now read it, like see the consequences. And if you don't like it, you made it. But, you know, so I think there's a power in that kind of writing. But I also think it's too, and it was a hopeful era, but it's too hopeful in this idea of connection. There is a kind of, and I said it, I found myself becoming kind of curmudgeonly lately about like the fact that it feels sometimes like feminism cannot exist without the internet now. And that's bullshit, because like it doesn't need to be conspiring with Jack Dorsey, you know, like, and similarly, yeah, sure, you know, reading about trauma can make people feel less alone. But it can also verge into pornographic territory. It can also be exploited by publishers, which happens to nearly every female writer, I suspect, at various points in their career. And it's only when you really start to tell your story on your own terms that you feel that ownership, I think. And this kind of alludes back to something earlier, but like, please no one think I treat writing as therapy, or that I believe writing is therapy, because it's not, you know, like it doesn't make things go away. It just gives you some perspective. And also remember, and you know, no one here probably needs reminding, but therapy is hard work. It's not just some magical release, you know. But so it obviously, you know, says a lot about the society we're in, that people are sharing their mental health struggles online. I think there's less of it around at the moment, maybe, because we're all more aware now that these things live forever. And I'd like to think we're out of the paying people $100 for their "it happened to me" story. You know, they deserve a bit more than that. Like I'm teaching creative writing now, creative nonfiction, and my students at NUIG have the most amazing stories to tell. And I feel like some cynical old hack saying this to them, but I'm like, don't waste that story. Tell it well, tell it on your own terms. Don't get ripped off, and don't do it for the shares, you know, like do it really well, because you owe your life that, you know, it's your story, tell it your way.
I think, I mean, that's a great note to stop there for a moment, guys, and let's go to the Q&A, because I know we have questions coming in here and comments. An earlier comment from 728 was, "This is a fantastic discussion. More tangents, welcome." I think that was when we were talking about drinking blood.
I'm the tangent queen. Like, if I can derail a conversation, I'll do it.
Catherine Gavin says, "The conversation is so inspiring, great material for writing." And I know Catherine is a student at NUIG. Deirdre Morley says, "A two-part question for both authors. When an idea strikes, how do you choose between a fiction or a non-fiction approach? And how do you decide on the ultimate form it will take? Essay, short story, novel, long form versus short form? Instinct or strategy, or is it a mix of both?" So, interesting question. Yeah. So first of all, how do you decide whether to tell it in fiction or non-fiction? And then what form? So yeah, Sophie, I guess, would you like to take that first?
Sure. God, it is such an interesting question, and it's hard to give a satisfying answer, because I feel that I think things present to me and it's all very, I just kind of do it by nose a bit, you know, like I think mostly my kind of fiction stuff tends to come out of conversations, and like I'll just, a line I'll snag on it, and I will, then it'll sort of snowball into a novel. It's actually funny I say snag, because my new novel is called The Snag List, and it started as an idea I was at a Christmas party in like 2019, I guess, presumably last time we were let out. And somebody was telling me all about this. It was great gossip on her street. They were all bitching about the builder on this WhatsApp group that they had put together. And I called the snag list, and I then, like, you know, whatever, cut to a year and a half later, and it became the basis of a kind of an idea that just, I find that for me, the ideas build and build. I think, I tend to, I think if characters are kind of coming with ideas for me, Deirdre, like that would be kind of how I'd know this is fiction, you know? Like, I think usually if it's a novel, I'm trying to suss something out that I'm witnessing in the world. And if it's non-fiction, I'm trying to suss something out that I'm witnessing in me, and seeking to connect that to the world. But I think that that's the kind of difference maybe with non-fiction for me. It sort of starts as a personal conundrum, and I try to bring it wider. Whereas with fiction, I think I invariably am pilfering from conversations with other people, articles I read, things like that, stuff that's very outside of me, and then I will usually run with those kinds of things. So that's sort of how I decide that. And then in terms of what form, like I'm more limited. Like, I have never attempted a short story. I'm actually, you know, I was only just talking to a friend earlier, Tanya, about your forthcoming collection, and I was like, I'm in such awe of people who can craft a short story. We were even saying earlier, I was like, I'm such a lazy bitch. Like, if I can say something in 10,000 words, you know, over 1,000 words, I'll say it in 10,000 words. I'll just be like, blah, 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 and like sprawling and no decisions made, just bang that all in, great fun. So I've never attempted a short story. So I think creative nonfiction, fiction, and screenwriting are my three forms. And I think that I'd love to try, actually. I would love to start. I read poetry every day. I have no idea how they do it. It's a dark art. I work with a poet actually as a mentee, and I love to work with his work, but I mean, I couldn't tell you how he's doing it, you know. So some kind of blood pact with I just blood pact with the poet demons. But and I like working in dialogue a lot, and I think that I tend to bring that through all of the things I write. So that would be the other kind of medium.
Okay, great. And Roshan, the same question for you then, because I know you said you're writing fiction now.
Oh man, I would like to say that, like, come down on the side and say that one is more honest than the other, and I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think that might be me just deluding myself, honestly, because, like, you're definitely freer to tell stories and to just be a magpie with fiction, I think, so far from my experiences. But aren't you doing exactly the same thing, you know, when you write an essay? Like, you're choosing to form a kind of coherence out of sometimes the chaos of life. And form has always been this big obsession of mine. I think in part maybe because I'm never fully certain. I like to have that structure to fall back on, but I'm also very big into kicking away the ladder. You know, so, you know, you can take the frame, you can take reality and arrange it into this lovely shape with an essay, and, you know, obey certain, I was going to say like unities, but that's theatre. But there are sort of there are unities of the essay too, I feel, or maybe they're not called unities, and someone needs to come up with that. It's thousands of years old as a concept, so we could update that. But while with fiction, God, and I'm just taking this off on another tangent, sorry, but like, I have to say, I also have a kind of contempt for linear narratives. Like, I despise Star Wars. Sorry to anyone watching, but just like, I kind of hate hero narratives, you know, and I love other frameworks which get usually called experimental just because they're not conventionally linear and they don't feature, you know, traits that we can all identify, but aren't they rigid structures of their own, you know, like, and a formally experimental piece of writing, of fiction, is still relying on its form to give it its cohesion and its momentum. how you choose which one reality can fit into experiences. I think that's something that time reveals to you and your feelings. And sometimes it's just as shallow as like, I'm tired of writing essays, so I want to do something else. You know, I want to just give myself a break, give myself a new challenge. And sometimes it's that with essays, I find, and this is like a kind of magical thinking, but it's true, you start to see these connections in things all around you, you know, or you start to see motifs surface again and again, and it kind of feels like the beginning of madness, but you can steer that into an essay. Usually you'll get that good feeling, you know. I saw a really interesting talk. It was a few weeks ago. It was with Benjamin Labatut, who wrote How When We Cease to Understand the World. And he said that his big inspiration is Adam Curtis documentaries. And I think that might have had a really big impact on me too, actually, when I think about it. Because like, it's that weird sense of just meandering through disconnected subjects, which then turn out to all be connected. I think we're probably all ripping off Sebald, and I just don't know because I haven't read Sebald. I need to eventually.
It's so funny. I was going to ask you if you'd watched Hyperrealization earlier in the talk there, Roshan.
Oh, he's such an influence on me. Although I think that documentary in turn may have ripped off Mark Fisher, who was a massive influence on me, like massive influence. And I got to interview him. I wrote about it in the book, like, but that was a turning point, I think, in my life as a writer, although I didn't see it that way at the time.
Yeah. Girls, there's another question here. It's quite a long one, so I'm going to make this the last question, actually. It's a question for both writers, talking about our increased obsession with tech and the relentless pursuit of progress for the sake of it. What are your thoughts about the automation of the creative field? You have language generators like GPT-3 writing essays convincing us that robots come in peace, and novels like Won the Road, which is the first novel written by a machine. The issue, of course, is that robots can replicate extraordinarily complex tasks, but thankfully don't yet understand what the patterns mean. Are publishers likely to find this attractive? And from a literary perspective, do you find it strange that we haven't yet seen many writers concerning themselves with these topics? Roshan, I'm going to go to you first on that one.
I'm going to call it, I think lawyers should be scared. And I think blockchain should be making lawyers scared. And I think maybe lawyers will become a whole lot more affordable for all of us. I'm not scared. I'm a writer and I'm not scared. Come at me, AI. Come at me. Singularity. So this whole thing fascinates me so much because the writing is frankly shit. You know, things like translation, functional writing, useless, awful emails that we don't want to write for work, you know, polite replies, all of that. Yeah, sure. But I guess it's going to differentiate the meaningful writing from the not meaningful writing, you know, and that's what we're in the business of here, the meaningful writing. So I think we're actually in a very safe human field, unlike a lot of people. The other side of it, acknowledging the creativity and also the kind of mysticism of some of the AI out there, I think it deserves a bit of attention. There's that thing, DeepMind, you know, like, but NVIDIA have made faces of people and they look real, but they're people who have never existed. And when I look at that, I just think like, that to me is so profoundly sinister and fascinating. And even things like that film, The Irishman, you know, and these weird, like artificially de-aged actors. I think we're in an age of shit robots. You know, we're in an age of boring dystopia where a lot of the things that are being touted as these magical solutions, like COVID track and trace, you know, AI, like here's something, the reason I don't fear the singularity is that AI on my phone thinks I want to read all the horoscopes every day. It hasn't copped that I have one horoscope. Like, you know, it's gonna take time. It's awe-inspiring and dramatic, but it's gonna take time. And yeah, I mean, I guess, so no, I don't have a lot of faith in AI writing. Maybe I'll live to like eat my words when the great general AI awakens.
We'll be all out of a job then.
I'll become a lawyer.
Yeah.
No.
And Sophie on that one as well.
Oh, it's so funny. It's so interesting because I just used a song lyric generator for fun for something I'm working on. And I hadn't actually really used one of these generator things before. And I was so tickled by the results of my song. So, you know, I went on the song generator and I wanted to write like a song about Eurovision, of course. And I was putting in all the keywords and it would ask me like, who's the protagonist in the song? Who's the hero of your song? And I was like, Niamh Kavanagh. And then she was like, what? And it was like, what does Niamh like to do? And I was like, Niamh likes to sing and dance and she loves Eurovision. And, you know, I was putting in all this info and the song that it gave back to me was so just wildly, just weird and wonderful. And it was, they gave me back the song and it's called An Underdog Kinda Singer. And it also generated an album cover that looked like this proper 90s Celtic mysticism kind of image on the album cover. And actually the AI came up with a really good refrain, if you ask me. So the chorus, the leading into the chorus, it's like, I like to contemplate Eurovision, but when I start to daydream, my mind turns straight to Ireland. And then the chorus is, do I love Ireland more than Eurovision? Do I love Ireland more than Eurovision? And so on. There's two more verses. There's a bit of I had to put in an antagonist for this song and I put in Louis Walsh and Dana. And so they come up in the third verse. But basically, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed thinking about these kind of like automated kind of like novel generators and poetry generators and things like that, because I think it's one of those really interesting times where our humanities really revealed to us, because obviously we speak the same language and we're feeding it inspiration or information, and it is regurgitating something that every time we'll be like, no,
I love how it
not
feels
quite.
it's so full of feelings and yet it doesn't know what feelings are. That like in spam fascinates me so much. You know, it's like, my sincerest affections for you.
Oh yeah.
Like, please send me your bank details, dear one. But like, yeah, and even like I had it in the book that like when Google brought in the predictive algorithms for the finishing emails, it kept saying, I love you all the time. It didn't know when it was appropriate to say, I love you. Like, you're right. It is revealing feelings. It is revealing something to us, but it's also kind of travestying them in this kind of sentimental, saccharine way, which is, it's adorable and hideous at the same time.
I know, you're so right. All those spam things that start, hello, dear. You're like, I'm not your, no, you're not my 90-year-old granny.
It's like AI is reaching out like, friend, friend.
Okay, ladies, we will have to wrap it up there. It's just a few more comments. Rob Doyle says, not a question, but this was such a lively and illuminating discussion. Thanks to all. Thanks, Rob, for tuning in. And Natalie King is a student at NUIG and she wants to know, which year of creative writing do you teach, Roshan?
They're the master's students.
Okay, yeah, there you go. So I don't know, Natalie, if you're on the BA or the MA. You must be on the BA, in fact, if you haven't come across Roshan, but maybe in the not too distant future. So ladies, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I think we could probably sit here and talk for another 2 hours, no problem, you know. Maybe we'll get to do it over coffee in real time. I'd love that. So thanks a million to Roisin Kiberd and Sophie White. Thanks to the Moore Institute and to John Kenny and Mike McCormick at NUIG. And thanks to everybody who's tuned in to the events in the Writer in Residence series. So thank you all and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye. Thanks everyone for coming.